Mickey Joe is a YouTuber all over the web who specializes in news, reviews, and gossip, especially on the West End, but he dips a toe into Broadway from time to time. A very knowledgeable guy with lots of interesting opinions on lots of things Broadway, and including Dear Evan Hansen. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Broadway Maven.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here talking to everyone today. And I'm very excited to talk about Dear Evan Hansen. So we're going to be talking about this show today. I want to talk about why it became such an impactful thing. This is a musical that won the Tony Award. It won the Olivier Award. It had one of the fastest made film adaptations from the stage, really in musical theatre history, and then all of this success, all of this stratospheric rise to becoming a cultural phenomenon was interrupted by the end of the world, by this world-altering Broadway and West End shutdown with the pandemic. And what happened with Dear Evan Hansen after that period, from when they reopened, from when the film came out, became a completely different story. It's a really interesting case. So we're going to talk about all of that today, and we're going to have a little segment from Mateo, who's going to talk to you about some of the score as well. So to give you a little bit of background, I don't know how well people know this show. Dear Evan Hansen first premiered in 2015 with a pre-Broadway run. It then ran off Broadway and then transferred to Broadway later in 2016. It started a US tour in 2018. In 2019, it came to the West End, and I was at the very first preview performance at the Noel Coward Theatre in London. The next time I saw the show in person was the final performance in London. So I saw the first show and the last show, and I just wanted to show you this as well. This I bought at the West End flea market. This is one of the casts used in the show. They actually have to cut it off afterwards. So they make them new for every performance. If you have no idea what this is and you don't know the show, I will explain why this is significant. Don't worry, but this is signed by some members of the West End cast as well. And if anyone does watch my YouTube videos on here, you can spot this probably hiding behind my head on my shelf of various theatre trinkets. But yes, so I said it opened in 2019 in the West End. Shortly afterwards, we had the film adaptation in 2021. Obviously, there is a conspicuous gap in 2020 where nothing much was happening. But by 2022, despite having had all of the success, both the Broadway and West End productions would close. We're going to talk about why that was and what changed the fate of this show over the next hour. So I want to talk to you about the original creative team for this show. So the score is written by Benj Pasek and Justin Paul. These are contemporary musical theatre writers who started their careers writing kind of edgy musical theatre scores. They wrote a song cycle called Edges. They wrote a musical called Dogfight, and then they wrote Dear Evan Hansen. And in this time, their sound had started to become a little bit more commercialized, and their ability to write really great commercial pop contemporary theatre scores served them very well, because they would go on to find huge success writing for movie musicals like La La Land and The Greatest Showman. And this is probably how they are best known. Exactly, they wrote The Greatest Showman. But prior to this, they had written Dear Evan Hansen. The book for the show was written by Stephen Levinson, and Dear Evan Hansen is a really interesting case, because if you think about musical theatre, and specifically really commercial and recent musical theatre, everything's an adaptation, right? That's a broad statement, but almost everything is an adaptation. You have shows that are based on films. Looking back, we have shows that are based on books. We have, I mean, even Sondheim's Little Night Music is an adaptation of a film, of an Ingmar Bergman film. We have shows that are adapted from operas, things like Rent, things like Miss Saigon, loosely but thematically taken from different operas. We have shows that are based on real life experience. And Dear Evan Hansen isn't, strictly speaking, an adaptation of anything. It is said to be loosely based on the adolescent experience of one of the composers, Benj Pasek, and things that he observed happening in his high school when he was growing up, but for a completely original story to have had this kind of success on Broadway and in the West End, it was quite unprecedented in 2016. The original director of Dear Evan Hansen was a guy called Michael Greif, best known for having directed Rent on Broadway. So Rent in the 90s was the first really huge musical theatre cultural phenomenon that engaged adolescent audiences, that got young people really excited about musical theatre. David will jump in here and correct me if I'm saying anything that he disagrees with. But Rent was this huge thing. And I would say after Rent, one of the next really big things was Spring Awakening. And then maybe after Spring Awakening, another really big thing might have been Next to Normal. That was another show directed by Michael Greif. I'm going to talk about that more in a few minutes. So remember the name Next to Normal. And then obviously Wicked's been in the mix here as well, but I'd say the next one of the next really big things was Dear Evan Hansen. Now, Dear Evan Hansen became this huge cultural phenomenon, more so than its stage success. It became really well known. A big part of that is the score. People listen to these songs, and Mateo's going to talk to you about why they made such an impact with people. Another big part of that is Ben Platt's performance. That became so talked about and so acclaimed online that became synonymous with the impact of this show and why people were so excited to go and see it. There was so much buzz around his performance. It was his first really big breakthrough role on stage. He'd been in The Book of Mormon before, but he'd been in various films like Pitch Perfect, and this was a really huge vehicle for him as it was being developed. Another reason that Dear Evan Hansen was so significant was to do with social media. So if you think about it, Dear Evan Hansen is talked about now as this show that was kind of the first to talk about mental health, and that's not strictly true. There have been many shows that have included mental health themes, and I'd mentioned before about Next to Normal. So this was on Broadway in 2007, 2008, I think, off the top of my head, sometime around then. And it didn't win the Tony Award, controversially, but it did win the Pulitzer Prize. And it's a very well-written musical that brings mental health themes viscerally to the forefront. So it's interesting to me to compare with these, why Dear Evan Hansen seemed to resonate with a wider audience and take on such greater levels of cultural significance. And I think there's a few reasons for this. So the show Next to Normal looks at a really specific instance of mental health within a family. They're very specific about the conditions that they talk about, and it talks about treatment, and it talks about all of these things. It's an amazing show with a fantastic rock score. But Dear Evan Hansen is decidedly vaguer in its approach, and it talks about themes within mental health rather than specific conditions or specific afflictions that will resonate with a whole load of people. It talks about loneliness, it talks about anxieties, and it talks about life events that may provoke and worsen those things. It talks about single parent households, it talks about bullying in schools, and you have all of these characters who all exist on this spectrum within mental health. And outside of Evan Hansen, who is the protagonist, there are a lot of other things we find out about the other characters in the show, and that, along with the power of the music and these lyrics, is what spoke to people and is what made it feel more powerful, and what allowed them to resonate more. I remember even at the final performance in the West End, just looking out across the auditorium and seeing people sobbing and passing tissues back. There was this profound sense of emotion and community within the theatre. People of all ages were being so profoundly impacted by this music and by this story and by the show. The other thing that was different between when Next to Normal came to Broadway and Dear Evan Hansen was, even in that short time, the way that we experience mental health issues had so changed because of the rise of social media. And that's what Dear Evan Hansen shows us very well. It is a huge factor in the plot. If you don't know the show, let me give you a little bit of an outline. So Dear Evan Hansen concerns a student named Evan who inadvertently finds himself wrapped up in a lie about him having had a friendship with another student at his school who recently passed away. And he, for various reasons, perpetuates this. Whether he does it for morally good reasons is a subject of debate. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But it allows him a certain amount of access to the boy's family, and he feels supported and seen in a way that he hadn't before. It's a very interesting story, but the way that the plot then develops is because of this social media impact. Footage of him giving this passionate speech goes online, and then the whole situation skyrockets. It becomes this enormous thing that he can't keep up with, this lie that he can't possibly keep justifying. And then the situation adapts again when another letter is put online, and then the mood of the community, the local community and the online community changes towards all of the characters in the story as well. It's a really compelling plot, so I don't want to spell out all of the details for you, but that is the nature of Dear Evan Hansen. So I do think social media was a big part of this show, but to give you a sense of how much cultural significance this took on, another musical called Be More Chill came to Broadway subsequently, and in marketing that show, they described it by saying it's as if the plant from Little Shop of Horrors ate Dear Evan Hansen. So we can see how much of a phenomenon Dear Evan Hansen has become at this point, that other shows are using this to try and justify people getting tickets. So I think that was everything I wanted to talk about in this first section. I have more to say after Mateo's stuff, David. So if you want to pass over to that now.
Terrific. Thanks, Mickey Joe, for getting us off on a good foot. Here is Mateo Chavez Lewis. He has his own YouTube channel called Music Theater Theory. So excited to bring those two channels together today. You'll see the kind of work Mateo does, which is generally at a piano explaining music theory as it applies to to Broadway shows. So here we go.
Hello, Broadway Maven. I'm Mateo Chavez Lewis, for those of you who don't know me. I am a frequent co-host of the Broadway Maven, and I also run the Music Theater Theory YouTube channel. The kind of theme song that I use on my YouTube channel goes like this. Music Theater Theory, whoa! That, obviously, if you know the show Dear Evan Hansen, you will recognize is a reference to Evan's big song at the top of Act 1 that he sings. It's called Waving Through a Window, and it sounds like that. Waving through a window! And it's kind of Evan's cry for connection. And it introduces us to the character of Evan in a really beautiful way. And I think that that song is responsible for a lot of the success of Dear Evan Hansen. It is certainly responsible for a lot of the way that Dear Evan Hansen connected to me when I was a high schooler dealing with mental health issues. And it's part of the reason I love the show so much. So I'm really, really excited to talk about it today. I wish that I could be with you talking about it in real time, and watching Mickey Joe and his section of the class as well, because I love Mickey Joe's YouTube channel, and I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. But unfortunately / fortunately, I booked a role in a workshop production at the Stratford Festival, which has started this week. So when you are watching this, I will be rehearsing at the Stratford Festival, which is a very big festival in Canada, and it's a pretty big step forward for my career as an actor. So I hope you will send me good vibes, and forgive me for not being able to be there in real time. But here we are. I'm going to take you through a little bit of the music of Dear Evan Hansen, and specifically talk about how this music allows us to cheer for Evan Hansen, even when he's doing things that we know are not the right thing. Evan Hansen is a character who obviously is really kind of messed up and has a lot of problems and doesn't know what the right thing to do is most of the time, partially because he's young and partially because he has this serious anxiety disorder that clouds his perception of reality. And so it's very difficult sometimes for us to cheer for this character because he's lying to a grieving family, he's kissing Zoe Murphy on the bed of her brother who committed suicide, which is just like, there's so many things that he does throughout the plot that are questionable. But partially because of the great book by Stephen Levinson, and partially because of the great music by Ben Pasek and Justin Paul, who also are famous for their work on The Greatest Showman and La La Land, to name a few. Because of all of this great writing and the amazing original performance by Ben Platt on Broadway, we understand why Evan is making those decisions, which makes it a little bit easier for us to still cheer for him and root for him to figure his stuff out. So I'm going to take you through how the music does that specifically. It starts at the very beginning of the show. The first thing we hear in the show is a series of technological sound effects and clippings from news segments, and it's this big overwhelming soundscape, and then lights click up on Evan Hansen. So it's the first thing we see in the show is Evan sitting alone on his bed, and we hear this music as he speaks to himself. He says, "Dear Evan Hansen, today is going to be a good day, and here's why." He's trying to give himself a pep talk, and we hear this music. Now this little motif here will come to represent kind of Evan's social anxiety, and it plays while he's giving himself this pep talk and telling himself how he's going to interact with the people in his high school, and then it also becomes the first piece of Waving Through a Window. I've learned to slam on the brake before I even turn the key, before I make the mistake. And this is a really brilliant little motif because it's very, very simple. It's just basically 3 notes in the left hand, and then this 2-note pattern repeated in the right hand. And with this repeated note, which gives us that feeling of anxiety, that dun, 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 dun. And when I saw the show on Broadway, Ben Platt even was kind of tapping himself anxiously to the rhythm of the music, which I thought was a really interesting touch. So this kind of, that repeating note represents Evan's anxiety and makes us understand right away, both from the monologue, where he's talking to himself, giving him the pep talk, and this is underscoring, and then in the next scene, when this is the intro to the song that he's singing, it makes us understand his anxiety, and we feel it very viscerally, and so we are able to relate to it. And because we know that the character's anxious, we're able to forgive some of the decisions that he makes, even when they're poor, if they are under the influence of anxiety, if that makes sense. Then Waving Through a Window happens. Now, Waving Through a Window, there are 2 factors to Waving Through a Window that make it a really powerful way of connecting us to Evan. The first one is that it uses a lot of classic pop techniques, so it sounds very familiar. It sounds like songs that you would hear on the radio. And so it feels like this is probably the kind of music that Evan Hansen listens to. That's why it's embedded in his heart and soul, and it's why it's the music that comes out when he needs to sing. Oftentimes I find the characters in musicals sing the kind of music that they would listen to. That is one technique for discovering the kind of musical sound of a character, and it's definitely used in this show. So you have the chords. Now those are very classic pop chords. They're called 6 minor, so it starts on a minor chord, which makes it kind of feel sad, and then it goes down to the 4 major, then the 1 major, and the 5 major. So it's this very, it sounds like a sad chord progression because it starts minor, right? But then all the other chords are major chords. So it's almost like it starts in this place of minor, but it goes to this place of major. So it's a very hopeful sound, and then it loops and loops and loops. And you hear that sound on the radio all the time, so it's hopeful and it's familiar, which makes us really connect to it. And then he also has this whoa little trill in his voice that makes us really feel connected to him as well, because it's a familiar pop sound, it's very expressive, and because the style of music he's singing is a style of music that the target audience, especially, which is like young teenagers, listen to all the time, it makes it feel relatable to them. The other thing is how high he's singing. Now, like, the average high note for like a tenor role on Broadway is an A flat. That's this note, right? In the first half of the song, before the key change, he's already singing a high A. Waving on that high A, waving through a window. And then when the key changes at the end, he's all the way up here on this B flat, which is a super, super high note for a male singer to sing. And it's waving! It's that really, really, really high B flat. And he sings it over and over. Is anybody waving, 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 wah? And so first of all, the fact that he's singing so high is impressive. It makes us lean in and want to watch because this performer's doing something pretty incredible. But also, it sounds like desperation. He's yelling at the top of his lungs, and we see how desperate he is for social connection. So we've seen the two things that kind of make up Evan's problems. We've seen his anxiety in this repeated button, and then we've seen his desperation for social connection in how high and loud he's yelling just for someone to hear him. And then, because it's all set to pop chords that we recognize, which carry a lot of hope in them, we see him as a hopeful, optimistic character, which also makes us want to cheer for him. And we see that he is singing music that we, as the target audience, if we are the target audience, which is young teenagers, we see that he's listening to the same kind of music as us, and that makes us relate to him and connect to him even more. So already, this is the first 15 minutes of the show, and between all of these different factors, we've set up that Evan is our hero and given us a lot of really good reasons to cheer for him. This is before the inciting incident in the story even takes place, and before he gets sucked into this lie. When he does get sucked into this lie, it's during a song called For Forever, which also is a song with so much hope in it. And this is the piano accompaniment. That's what it is. Oh, no, wait, So it's this flowing kind of sound in the right hand. And then in the left hand, we have these semitones, right? That's just right next to each other on the piano, see that? And because they're right next to each other on the piano, those two notes have a really close relationship, and there's a lot of like tension and release between them. So, da-da, da-da. So it sounds very, because there's so much tension and release, it sounds very emotional. And so we see that, and so this is playing underneath the song that Evan is singing when he is first making this story up, and when he's first telling the Murphy family about this fabricated friendship. And so we hear that it's coming from a very emotional place, right? It's coming from a place of hope and of wanting that social connection that we just saw him screaming for and waving through a window, and it's coming from a place of anxiety that we just heard that tap 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 of the anxious repeated note, right? We've seen these things. We know that he's a person with a lot of hope, even though he's really anxious and really desperate for social connection. So all of that comes together, and we know from the way that the semitones are moving in this really emotional way, even though he's lying, we know it's coming from an emotional place, which I think really helps us understand why he's doing it. Because if it was a very intellectual exercise, if he was just saying the words without a lot of feeling behind them, it would make it much easier to believe that he was trying to be manipulative or trying to get something or trying to play the Murphy family like a chess game. But he's not, right? It's so genuinely emotional. Like, listen to how emotional that tension and release in the left hand with this flowing right hand is. Like, it's beautiful music. And because that's there constantly underneath the the music of underneath the song For Forever, when he's making this lie, we understand that the lie is not malicious. We understand that it comes from a really genuine place, and it comes from his heart, and he really wants to do good with it. Then the last thing I want to point out here is that in the song Good For You, which happens in the second act, this is kind of when everyone's starting to suspect that Evan is lying. The people who know he's lying are kind of feeling a little bit like Evan is forgetting about them because he's so happy in his new life. Like his mother, it feels like he's forgetting about her, and his friend Jared feels a little bit stiffed, and so does his friend Alana. He's kind of neglecting the important relationships in his life because he's living in this fantasy land with the Murphy family, and these other characters kind of don't like that, so they're singing this song called Good For You. And they all sing it, Evan, they're all really angry, and it goes, so you got what you always wanted, so you got your dream come true, good for you, you. And of course, hearing that for Evan, like, really stresses him out, right? Like it makes him feel the guilt of like, yeah, you know what, this is a lie, and maybe I don't deserve this, and it reawakens those feelings of anxiety and self-hatred that he had at the beginning of the musical, which kind of went away when he found this community with the Murphy family. But this song, and hearing these characters say these things to him, kind of reawakens that. And in order to make us feel Evan's stress and feel how high the stakes are for Evan, we get this music. Actually, I don't think that's the right chord progression. You say when you play, you need to play. And if somebody's in your way, crush them and leave them behind. That's the chord progression. What's interesting though about it is not the chord progression is not super important because it's pretty standard. I mean, it starts on a minor chord, which is interesting, and then goes to another minor chord, which is also interesting, the minor sound. But the really interesting part about Good For You is the time signature. Now, most music we counted in 4 or 8 or some kind of meter like that is divisible by, or is like a power of 2. You know, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you're a dancer, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then there's also, alternatively, the second most common way that we count music is in 3, multiples of 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, which creates this waltz feeling. Something we don't see a lot is counting in 7, which is a prime number. We often do not see music being counted in a prime number greater than 2 or 3, because 2 or 3 is kind of the most the most basic way that music is divided, at least in Western music. But here we have 7 beats to a bar, which creates this feeling. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Like where the 1 is always coming a beat earlier than you expect. Because you expect 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But we just shave off that 8 at the end and we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3. Which creates that startling feeling, you know? And because of that, we feel how scary and stressful this situation is for Evan. And he even sings in the 7/8 time, near the end of the song, he sings, all I need is some time to think, 'cause the boat is about to sink, can erase what I wrote in ink. Oh, that's where the chord progression changes, my bad. All I need is some time to think, 'cause the boat is about to sink, can't erase what I wrote in ink. Tell me, how can I change the story? All the words that I can't take back, like a train coming off the track, 'cause the rails, my bones all crack. I gotta find a way to stop it, stop it. Then we go into this key change, and then we go back to the chorus. So we get this like 7/8 feeling, which is really creates that anxiety for Evan. And which also helps us cheer for him to figure it out. We want him to find a way out of this pickle because we hear how stressed out he is, and we also remember that, like, from the beginning, he is a good guy deep down, And he did get into it, remember, from a place of genuinely wanting to do good and wanting to find connection. And we remember that, and now we see how stressed out he is, and we want him to figure it out. Like, we as the audience want him to figure it out. We want him to find a way to be honest, and to be honest with himself, and to heal, and to grow, and to learn his lesson. We want that for Evan. And if we've been listening to the music, that is how we're going to feel about him. And I think that's the only reason that this show works, because ultimately, yeah, he does do some pretty crappy things, right? He lies to this grieving family. He, like I said, he literally tries to kiss Connor's sister on her dead brother's bed, which is pretty, like, if you think about that for a few seconds, you start to get weirded out. But you understand why he's doing it all, because he's coming from this really genuine place, and this place of anxiety, and this place of desperation, right? Whoa! And because of that, because you understand why he's doing it, you cheer for him to figure it out. You don't cheer for him to successfully ruin the lives of the grieving family, but you do, hopefully, if you're a compassionate and empathetic person, you do have compassion and empathy for Evan's situation as well, and you cheer for him not to continue to ruin the grieving family's life, but you cheer for him to figure it out. You cheer for him to learn his lesson, and to learn that he doesn't have to lie in order to find love and connection. And at the end of the show, that is the lesson that he learns. And I think that's why the show is so powerful, because it forces us to cheer for, or to at least empathize with a character who's doing the wrong things, because it's showing us that, the music is showing us that he's doing the wrong things for the right reasons. And he does learn his lessons in the end, and we get to watch him grow. And I think especially in this like social media age, where everything is black and white, everyone is either a horrible person or an amazing person, and in a time of cancel culture and everything, I think it's really, really important that we have these stories of nuanced characters who do bad things for the right reasons and learn their lessons and are still good people overall in the end. And I think that the music helps us feel that about Evan Hansen. So there you go. That's my 2 cents. There's some interesting fun facts about Dear Evan Hansen. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the class. Back to Mickey Joe.
Amazing. So pleased that Mateo could put that together.
Mickey Joe, I'm going to do the announcements now with your permission.
I think that's probably a great time to do that, David. You go ahead.
I know there are a lot of new people here, and I'm very excited to welcome everybody new and tell you what's coming up in the class. This is about a 1-minute coming attractions video. Hopefully there won't be an Israeli commercial first. Here we go. Coming up at the Broadway Maven, Dear Evan Hansen, Oklahoma, and Kiss Me Kate. The Broadway Maven is the only free weekly Broadway appreciation course you'll find online. Every week we look at topics as diverse as Wicked, Mel Brooks musicals, and Gershwin on Broadway. So there you see the interview that I did with Winnie Holtzman, who wrote the book for Wicked. We occasionally have big names, and I've just confirmed, literally yesterday, I confirmed that on the Sunday, the 9th of April, we will be having Michael R. Jackson, who won the Pulitzer and the Tony for A Strange Loop, will be coming to class. I hope you all can make it, because he's fascinating and his show is terrific. Here's what's new for the week of January 29th. YouTubers Mickey Joe Theater and our own Mateo Chavez Lewis will be presenting a class on Dear Evan Hansen on January 31st. Every week in February, we'll be doing a Rodgers and Hammerstein show, starting with Oklahoma. On Tuesday, February 7th, we'll have a class on Kiss Me Kate. Upcoming all-access experiences include a lecture by Peter Felicia about the women of Rodgers and Hammerstein, guest speaker YouTuber Michael Ratty on rhymes, and a watch party on Lil Abner. The Broadway Maven's Weekly Blast comes out every Thursday. It contains essays, reviews, YouTube gems, surveys, and more. And then there's a YouTube channel, which has more than 150 videos on all aspects of musical theater. Recent videos include a Broadway Settings quiz, Disney's Greatest Villain song, the music of Hamilton explained, the nude scene in Hair, and the AI chatbot interprets Sondheim. For more information on all classes and projects, or to sign up, visit thebroadwaymaven.com. Okay, and coming back to your fascinating class. Looking forward to hearing what else you have to say, Mickey Jo.
Okay, thank you so much, David. So I really enjoyed listening to everything that Mateo was talking about there with the score. The crux of why it's also interesting, as he kept telling us, is because you have this character who is telling these lies, and we know that he's lying, and we know the gravity of the situation he's in. He is lying to this family who is grieving this son who has recently committed suicide, and he is discernibly trying to make them feel better, ends up trying to further that to ingratiate himself to this family, but because the music is so aspirational, it's somewhat at odds with that. I want to just briefly look at some of the responses. So we put up a video featuring some of the score on David's YouTube channel, and we encourage people to talk about how the songs make them feel, because it's not always synonymous with how you would be feeling if you think about the significance of that moment in the plot. So let's have a look at some of the responses here. So Marlene has said, "You Will Be Found expresses my high school angst, feeling like an outsider, not in the in crowd, with very few friends." Someone else has said, "You Will Be Found has become the anthem for adolescent mental health awareness today." It absolutely has. This song has taken on this huge life where it's this enduring message of togetherness, and that everyone is eventually going to be okay. It sort of has a familiarity of the It Gets Better campaign against LGBT plus bullying. What else do we have here? For Forever is a beautiful song about an unfortunately imaginary day spun for the parents' benefit. It is so carefree, you feel you're experiencing it with them. I want to talk a little bit about this song. So this was the middle of the three songs that Mateo was playing for us just now, the one that felt so aspirational and soaring and positive, where you knew that his lie wasn't malicious because the music was so empowering. It was almost like a Disney I Want song. I want to look at some of the lyrics to this, because he begins quite tentatively, and you hear that in the music as well. And then as he is growing more confident in telling this lie and imagining this day, that you can tell he is enjoying the fantasy and the lie just as much as they're enjoying hearing it, his lyrics become more colorful and more detailed, and he starts using metaphor. And he says things like, where do I have it here? He sings, "And there he goes, racing towards the tallest tree. From far across the yellow field, I hear him calling, follow me. There we go, wondering how the world might look from up so high, one foot after the other, one branch then to another." And he is recalling climbing trees in an orchard. And here, this is similar to an event that he's actually done the previous summer, where he was working with trees. And we keep finding out more and more details about this. Towards the end of the show, we will find out that Evan Hansen, the protagonist, who doesn't necessarily present to us, the audience, all of the details about himself straight away, he tried to commit suicide that previous summer while he was working in this job by jumping off of one of the trees. And what's fascinating here is the story he's telling with Connor, this boy who has recently committed suicide, is that he's following Connor up this tree. And we hear this lyric. He says, "From far across the yellow field, I hear him calling, follow me." And almost without realizing, I think, what he's saying metaphorically, there's this implication that Connor, as this now deceased presence, is kind of luring him similarly. Apologies if it's just suddenly gotten very loud in the very loud kitchen at the moment. And then when he starts to realize what he's comparing it to, and he's recalling this event from his past, and he talks about falling out of the tree, he says, "And I suddenly feel the branch give way. I'm on the ground, my arm goes numb." And his lyrics suddenly become shorter. He has less detail, and he is confronted with the reality of what actually happens. Shortly after that, the melody transposes down, and it all starts to feel a little less optimistic. Some of the other responses we have here to the homework task: "You Will Be Found makes me feel hopeful, emotional in a good way, willing to sing it, Words fail, I feel like crying while singing. Words fail is this big confession song he sings at the end. It's tortured and emotional, but it's also very truncated, and it's doesn't flow particularly naturally. It has these different sections because he has these peaks of emotion where he's suddenly pouring out and then very reserved. It's a lot like having this hysterical outburst would be in real life. A lot of you have talked about You Will Be Found, and what's interesting is it is this emotional, incredible, empowering song that has this positive message. They sing "You are not alone, you are not alone" over and over and over again at the end, and the enduring message is just this: you will be found. So what's interesting about this within the context of the show, this ends the first act, and it sounds incredibly uplifting, and all of the characters feel very positively about this. Only we, the audience, realize this song for what it is, because we know that this is still based on a lie. He's giving this song as a speech at a memorial for Connor, pretending that they were best friends, when in reality, they didn't know each other. So what's interesting is Benj Pasek and Justin Paul remind us of this by ending the song in the moment that he kisses Connor's sister on Connor's bed. They play these sinister chords over the end of the song. Now, in the way that the show is marketed, You Will Be Found has been performed all over TV. It has been performed everywhere, but don't use that ending of the song. They use a more uplifting ending, which makes a lot of sense. They don't want to give away the plot, and it would seem odd to a TV audience who don't know the context as to why this uplifting song about mental health sounded so sinister at the end. When I was talking to Mateo about this show and about his thoughts on it, he made a really great inference here, because the marketing of the show shifted before and after the pandemic. When it first opened on Broadway, it was all about Ben Platt's incredible performance and about this troubled high school teen and how he navigated these issues in his life. So they went on late night American TV, and Ben Platt performed Waving Through a Window, the first song Mateo played you, the one that was capturing his anxiety with music. They also performed the scene leading into that, where you could see how nervous and anxious he was, and that was the selling point of the show. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, audiences weren't desperate to see a show about someone struggling to contend with serious mental health issues. That wasn't the mood of the post-pandemic audience. People wanted something more uplifting. People wanted togetherness because we'd been kept apart for so long. So they then started redirecting, and they made the marketing of the show and the message of the show about togetherness and about these uplifting themes, a lot like the musical Come From Away. So what's interesting is an audience who are buying tickets based on hearing You Will Be Found, then seeing it for the first time in the context of the show might feel a little bit duped, that it's not actually this wholly honest and genuine message, because the context of it changes an awful lot. So this takes us to the other side of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the Dear Evan Hansen film was released. I've seen a few comments already about some of the songs that were cut from the film adaptation. As I mentioned before, this was one of the fastest film adaptations. I mean, in the 2000s, we were still getting Sondheim musicals only just coming to film, things like Sweeney Todd, things like Into the Woods. In the Heights took over a decade to make it from the film, from the stage to the film. It's not usual for us to see something so quickly adapted for film, but the reason it happened this time is because they always wanted Ben Platt to be involved, and he was aging out of being able to play a teenager. So the film happened reasonably quickly, and Dear Evan Hansen, and Ben Platt reprised his performance in the film. This was met with a little bit of controversy. I don't know how many of you might have seen the film, but a lot of people had mixed feelings. Some people were thrilled that he was doing it again, that his performance was being captured, his Tony Award-winning performance, which I do think was a great thing, because so often in the 20th century, we had these Tony Award-winning stars in Broadway roles, people like Gwen Verdon in Sweet Charity, not that she won the Tony, but these acclaimed performances who were then being replaced with film actors when it was adapted for film. In the Sweet Charity film, it became Shirley MacLaine. So it's a rarity for us to have a stage performer getting to reprise their role on film. However, as someone has just commented in the chat, the criticism was that Ben Platt had aged out of the casting bracket at this point, and he didn't, especially on screen, necessarily look convincingly teenage. People will still debate about this as to whether or not he looked appropriately young enough for the film, but the passion of his performance definitely endured. However, the film was not received critically particularly well. It was not a huge commercial success. A lot of this had to do with the way that the pandemic had affected people going to the cinema, but even a lot of fans of the show weren't necessarily as enamored with the film, and they didn't think it necessarily captured the messages and the themes of the show in the same authentic way that everyone felt from the stage version. And this discernibly started to hurt both the Broadway and the West End productions of the show, because it wasn't too long after this that both of them would announce that they were closing. So the film came out in 2021, and in 2022, the show closed on Broadway and it closed in the West End at the same time. I think a lot of this is the responsibility of the film. Like someone's literally just said, the film has put someone off of going. I think had it been this huge success, had the film been amazing, it would have redirected more people to see the stage show. Matilda is still running in the West End. It's been running in the West End for over a decade, and that's selling really well at the moment. I think a large part of that is because of the success of the film adaptation. People see it and they think, oh, let's go and see it at the theatre. Dear Evan Hansen had the opposite problem, where bad press from the film and a certain amount of bad taste in people's mouths meant that audiences were staying away. So unfortunately, that is a big part of what negatively affected the ticket sales for Dear Evan Hansen on Broadway in the West End. I do also think that it just wasn't necessarily the perfect show for people to go and see right after theatres were reopening. Like I said, there had been so much separation in the pandemic, and people longed for togetherness, something like A Come From Away, something more uplifting, or even just something completely distracting, a fun, glitzy musical that was going to take people away from their anxieties and their troubles, rather than being confronted with them on stage. So yes, so the last thing I want to talk about, just for the last 10 minutes or so, is to do with this morality of Dear Evan Hansen, because Mateo touched on it a little bit. We have this character who is telling a lie, or who gets caught in a lie, and it's interesting because we see the circumstances where this begins. We understand why he gets stuck in this lie. He has written a letter to himself on assignment from his therapist. It reads, "Dear Evan Hansen, today is going to be a good day, and here's why." And it devolves into angst because he's had a terrible day. His first day back at school, it hasn't gone well. So he writes an angsty letter to himself. Connor finds it in one of their few interactions and keeps it on his person. Shortly after Connor kills himself, his parents have found this letter and misinterpreted it as a letter that he had written to Evan. They believe it to be his suicide note. From that, they convinced themselves that Evan and Connor were friends. Connor had also written his name on Evan's cast. Evan has this cast because he broke his arm falling out of the tree. We come to learn the significance of this later on, like I told you. So it's very difficult for him to escape how desperately Connor's parents want this to be true at the very beginning of the show. And he sort of participates in this to try and help. But it's not like we see him going into it maliciously. It's not like we see him going into it deliberately to dupe anyone or to try and get anything. So it was kind of a surprise to me where after the pandemic, the mood of a lot of theatre fans towards Evan as a character had really changed. And I think people were a lot more supportive of him within the context of the plot before that. I think there was definitely this shift where people started to think that he was this amoral Sorry, I've got a dishwasher attempting to take off in my kitchen. Bear with me 1 second. There we go. So yeah, I think everyone started viewing him as this amoral character who did this terrible thing, which is surprising to me. And I do think it's definitely a younger audience who deal in these kind of moral absolutes, because if you look back at previous shows, you have things like Sweeney Todd, where these morally grey areas of these characters who would do these morally very dubious things are still presented as protagonists. So I'm curious about people's thoughts on this in the comments section. We're getting a few comments already. What do you think? David's made a very good point here about the show's marketing, about kind of suggesting moral absolutes when that's not really what the nature of the show is. But if you know the show at all, if you've seen the film or the stage version, what do you think about the character of Dear Evan Hansen, how he's presented, and whether we are supposed to align with him morally? Phantom of the Opera is another great example. That's somebody's said here, everyone loves the Phantom, even though he's a creep. I'm fascinated by the extent to which people will still support wishing that Christine had chosen the Phantom over Raoul, because he does these unspeakably terrible things and he doesn't treat her particularly well or invite her in romantically, particularly consensually. Is my audio better now? I've got a rogue dishwasher going on. Is that better? People are nodding. I've been talking to myself for a while, but you can put it all together. So yes, just to finish then, thoughts on Evan Hansen, anything else about the show that you would like to chat about, if anyone has any other questions?
So, Mickey Joe, why don't we let people raise their hands, and I'll call on if anybody has something they want to share. Raise your hand big like that, or put your hand up in the participants list. Let's start with Shayla. Hi, Shayla, what's on your mind?
Hi there. I haven't been here in a really long time, so it's so nice to get back to this. So, hi everyone. You know, I read the book before I saw the movie, and I never saw the stage show, but I discovered Dear Evan Hansen in the summer of 2020 when everybody was feeling pretty down about everything. And I sat in my backyard listening to it on Spotify over and over and over. I think it was my most played thing. But in the book, there's a complete subplot of Connor being gay and being a ghost around Evan, and also a secret lover or friend that Connor had that we learn about. And that they completely erased, I think, from the show, but definitely from the film. Any thoughts on why they did that?
Kayla, the book came after the show.
Really?
The show's based on the book, yeah.
Oh, I thought the book came first. Okay. Interesting. I don't know why they added that to the book then. That's interesting.
It's an interesting one. I think it's a really rich addition to the book that I wish they had included in the film actually as well, because I think it's great to be able to expand on Connor's character. But I think ultimately what they wanted to do was, we don't really learn about Connor as a character. There are a lot of questions that are never answered, and it's more about what he represents and the fact that none of these people really knew him. Evan didn't know him. Alana, who was also at the school, who also capitalizes on his suicide, she didn't know him either. But no, as David has said, the book came after the show, which speaks to how much, like I said, of a cultural phenomenon Dear Evan Hansen became, because it was adapted as a narrative story after the stage musical, which I don't know if that's ever happened before, David. I can't think of any other examples.
Yeah, I imagine that if there's a buck to be made, people will do it that way. But I have a different question for you, which is goes into a little bit of risky territory. There's too much hate towards Evan Hansen online, in my opinion. Too much hate directed towards him, and not enough directed at Alana, because she's a pretty dreadful character. She's interested in her college applications more than she is in helping people, and she pushes things along in sort of a reckless manner. And I don't see people complaining about that. And I'm wondering what you think.
I find her incredibly frustrating in the stage version, because I think she pushes Evan to keep going with this when he isn't always comfortable to. And then the lyrics that she sings in Good For You is demanding an apology for him. And I can't see any real transgressions he's committed against her. But for what it's worth, I think she's one of the few characters who is represented better on film. So they added a song for the film for Amanda Stenberg, who plays Alana. and we understand a lot more about her character and her perspective, and she's less harsh. So I find her easier to enjoy in the film version than the stage version.
Cool. Let's go with Maddie. Maddie, what's on your mind?
Hey, so I just had a question. Probably you mentioned this in the when Mickey was speaking, but probably I missed it. So I was just curious, like, why did like Dear Evan Hansen close on the West End? Was there like a main reason?
So everything closes basically because the ticket sales had started to dwindle, because the advanced ticket sales weren't looking as promising, and so the producers and the theatre owners in conjunction would have decided that they didn't want Dear Evan Hansen to extend anymore. People weren't buying tickets as much, and I think that's to do with the film didn't do very well. It put a lot of people off of buying tickets, and also, like I said before, coming out of the pandemic, I don't think as many people were excited to go and see something that they knew was going to be emotionally challenging and upsetting and cathartic. I think people wanted uplifting and diverting shows instead.
Here's Janice. Janice, what's on your mind?
So hey to everybody. Hello from Germany, Hamburg. So I was thinking, since I've been reading the German book, I've been reading the English book, I'm German by the way, and I've been seeing the show on the West End. I've been thinking, are there any rumors about it coming to Germany? Because there are many popular shows who already came to Germany, like for the first translation ever. Like I've seen Hamilton already a few times in Hamburg. It's fantastic, everybody. It's so great. As a native speaker, it's so good. I can't talk about it enough. But like, are there any rumors? Because I don't really like the German book. Maybe it's just because like these pearls of them like singing are in my mind, and if I read it in German, it's like not.
How about it, Mickey Joe? What do you think? Germany?
I think hopefully it will at some point. I mean, shows like Next Normal have made it to mainland Europe. I haven't heard any specific rumors about Germany, but I'd be really interested if it does, whether Germany gets a non-replica production, because we've only ever had that same one production of Dear Evan Hansen. I know recently Germany got the non-replica production of Wicked that was really exciting, so I think that could be very fun.
Mickey Joe, not everybody knows the difference between a replica and a non-replica production. Why don't you explain?
So when I'm saying a non-replica production, I mean not the original sets, different choreography, different direction, different costuming. So Wicked in Hamburg recently had a production with different costumes. Elphaba had a red wig rather than her black hair on Broadway. The way that she flew at the end of Act 1 was completely different. Rather than being raised up in a cherry picker, she was on wires and she was flying all around. Different choreography, everything very different about the show.
Thanks. Other hands, please. Other questions or comments? Raise your hands big or put your hand up in the participants list. Here's Sherry. Hi, Sherry. What's on your mind?
I just wanted to say that I saw it before the pandemic, and I'm a high school teacher, and I was very sympathetic to Evan. I saw his social anxiety and kids that I knew well, and I saw him as an Asperger's kid who kind of got trapped in the middle of that initial lie, and he was really trying to make the parents feel better. And then it just kept going on from there, and it got out of his control. But
Sherry, the way Ben played it really underscores that he wouldn't let his mother touch him, for example. He would cringe, and I think there's a good case to be made that Evan is on the spectrum. What do you think, Mickey Joe?
I think so as well, and I think I've been a teacher as well for a lot of years, and I think you see in a lot of students with those kind of needs and those kind of conditions that they can be really receptive to other people's emotional states. And so I think there's an awful lot of, he's really aware of the guilt. And there are even lines in the script where he talks about how he notices how hard it is for them and he just wants to make them happy. So I think the first inclination that he gets that his words bring them something, we see it at the start of the song for Forever. We see that having an effect on them, and we see him seeing that, and he starts to pick up the pace and he's responsive to that. So I think when you realize that's his motivator, you start to understand him a bit better.
So here we are at 1. I want to thank everybody for coming. We had a lot of interesting conversations. There are still 3 hands up. I'm sorry we don't have a chance to get to all that, although maybe Mickey Joe, you can stick after and take a couple of questions. You don't have to. But thank you so much, Mickey Joe. His channel is at Mickey Joe Theater with all over the web, and every single platform you can find, he's there. And pretty much, certainly every week you do a vlog, and almost every day you've got something going on your YouTube channel, which is really, really fun to watch. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Great. Can you take a question or two? Or you need to go. It's okay if you do.
I can take a question or two. That's absolutely fine.
Terrific. Shayla, what's on your mind?
Sorry. Hi. Any thoughts on why they cut? Does anybody have a map from the film?
I think in the show, they just have a little bit more space to explore that. And I think with the film, our focus in cinema is just so much more narrowed. I think they felt like we had to get to him faster. People have always talked a lot about why Does Anybody Have a Map open to the stage show, and that it's unusual potentially not to hear from him first. And I think the director for the film, obviously just being a different director from the stage production, perhaps just felt that we ought to get to Evan a little bit faster.
To me, that was a shame, because that was something that resonated the most with me, that song, not being a teenager anymore, but having teenagers. So, yeah.
Thank you. Phil?
When we saw the show on Broadway at the end of the first act, Evan was on stage reading his speech to the audience. I mean, reading his speech to the high school class, and he was going through his cards, and then the cards started flying out of his hand, and then the act ended, and the card flipped down. We were in the third row, so a guy right in front of us caught this card, and he showed it to us. And sure enough, it was the scribble of a high school kid reading exactly what Ben Platt read, which I thought was just such a lovely touch. It wasn't, in Greek, and it wasn't just made up. It wasn't typed. It was like a high school scribble. I thought that was really a lovely touch. The question I have, or the point I want to make, is that I thought that the show really raised an interesting issue of what is a higher moral imperative? What's a higher moral good? I mean, here's Evan lying. He knows he's lying, and other people know he's lying. And yet it's providing solace, a very meaningful, wonderful solace to the Murphy family who've lost their son, don't know what to do. And the mother particularly is just so bereft. And here's Evan filling in some gaps, which for her were so comforting. And I think it raises the issue of, well, is lying always bad? Is it always wrong? Or is there a way in which that lie, maybe it could have ended differently, right? It could have resolved differently. It resolved in a way where he had to come clean and all of that. But it just raised the issue for me as to, well, when is something like that perhaps a higher good than telling the truth and having this family just deflate and bereft and with no solace to gain from that?
I agree. I think it talks about interesting gray areas within all those kind of moral things. But I think that's an excellent point, and an amazing anecdote about the Broadway production as well.
So it is an interesting anecdote. I think that the show, though, because the lie gets out of hand so quickly, that the show is telling us even a little lie you have to be very careful with, because it can spin out of control. I think that's part of the message too. I don't know if it's Leah or Leah, but it's your turn.
Hi. Do you think if Dear Evan Hansen hadn't opened just before the pandemic, it would have had more success in the long term?
I think certainly in the West, I think just had it not been for the pandemic in general, it would have had more success in the West End. We saw that with a few shows here in London that were building up momentum. I think And Juliet as well would also be running longer here in London if it hadn't been that they were interrupted, because they're trying to find an audience. They're trying to build up this momentum and public recognition, which is really what shows here in London need to be able to survive long term. It's not just theatre fans you need to convince, you need to be able to get everyone in the wider consciousness to know that they are here. So I do think, I think the pandemic definitely hurt Evan Hansen and Juliet in the West End.
And here's another video about Dear Evan Hansen.